We've talked a lot on this channel about the vital importance of Ukraine's allies and partners, the nations that have, from February 24th, kept up a constant supply of financial assistance and weapons that have allowed the Ukrainians to continue fighting. But what we haven't talked about as much are Russia's partners, and in particular their closest partner, Alexander Lukashenko's Belarus, a nation with a GDP the size of Montana, a military budget about a third the size of Burger King's annual revenue, and which since February 24th has constantly been rumoured to be on the cusp of an imminent invasion of Ukraine in support of its Russian ally. So today we look at Belarus and we look at the Belarusian Army and ask the question of what would happen if they invaded Ukraine, and how likely is it that they do so? Is this a clear and present danger, or just an empty threat? So what am I going to be covering today? I think first I'm going to try and answer this question of how we got to this point, and that means covering a little bit of Belarusian history and also looking a little bit closer at Belarus's current ruler, Lukashenko. Then we're going to look at the Belarusian army, what is its current quality, what's its funding like, what sort of equipment does it use, what's its training like, and evaluate its combat potential. Then we're going to apply that information to looking at some of the options for intervention, or at least the options that have been discussed, from the wild and wonderful options that are put out by some in the media to a more restrained option where Belarus is just acting as a support actor and a distraction for Russia on the northern front. Then we're going to look at some of the reasons for Belarusian hesitation. Why might Belarus not want to intervene in the current crisis? What are the dangers for Lukashenko and the Belarusian regime? And then finally, close out with a little bit of a warning. Alright, so first let's ask the question of how did we get to the point that Belarus might be threatening or posturing to invade Ukraine in the first place? And of course, since it's my channel, that means going back several hundred years and doing a deep dive into Belarus's history. And remember, this is Eastern Europe, so there's going to be a couple of constants. Firstly, it's going to be complicated. Two, it's going to have an awful lot in common, or at least rhyme with the history of some of the other states we've talked about. So if you've seen my videos on the history of Finland and Sweden and Poland, some of this might seem a little bit familiar to you. Now, after the Mongols do some significant political remodeling in what's now known as Russia, the territories of modern Belarus pass largely within the territory of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. You might remember the Grand Duchy of Lithuania from my video on Poland. Its greatest extent is marked there in green. For those who watched that video, you'll know that the Grand Duchy of Lithuania later merges with Poland into personal union and becomes the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a major power that persists in Europe for many, many centuries. So there's this stretch of time where what is now Belarus has a significant Lithuanian and Polish influence. The Polish language grows. There is some expansion of Catholicism in its territory. So when you hear modern people talking about the brotherhood between Poland or Lithuania and Belarus, it goes all the way back to this. And when you look at the flags that protesters waved in the 2020 protests against Lukashenko, and you see that figure of a knight on horseback, that imagery dates back to this era, the imagery that is associated with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Just a little bit of proof that history is enduring. Anyway, the territory eventually passes to the Russian Empire in 1796. You'll remember from my Polish video, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is steadily broken down, it's partitioned in 3 waves, and eventually, Belarus, as part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, is annexed essentially into the Russian Empire and becomes a Russian territory. And just like Congress Poland, just like Finland, in the mid-1800s, there is a big push towards Russification. This is pushing the influence of the Russian language, this is the pushing of the Russian alphabet, this is the pushing of Russian laws, customs, and religion into Belorussia, and just like many other places, it leads to major revolts in the 1860s. Again, you've heard this story before by now. 1918 comes. The Russian Empire is soundly defeated in the First World War, and so the territory, or a part of the territory of Belarus, declares independence in 1918, but the Soviet-Polish War happens, and the aftermath of that war leads to the territory of what we would call Belarus being partitioned between Poland. So much of what is now Western Belarus moves into the territory of Poland, where it remains for a number of years, and the rest becomes part of the Soviet Union and the Belarusian SSR. Now, World War II is utterly devastating for both parts of modern Belarus, the part that was in Poland and the part that was part of the Soviet Union. Indeed, Belarus wouldn't really return to its pre-war population, depending on what measure you use, until roughly the 1970s. The territory is utterly destroyed, and as a result, in the reconstruction period, there are significant demographic and geographical adjustments. For one thing, the Belarusian SSR gains what was at the time territory of Poland in the east, The Poles are largely through, in inverted commas, population exchange agreements, pushed into the territories of modern Poland. Modern Poland gains significant territories in the west at the expense of Germany as compensation for giving up territory in the east to the Soviet Union. So there's a reconstruction process which again thoroughly enhances the Russian character and relationship between Belarus and the Russian people through this Soviet reconstruction project. Now, reconstruction really does shift the nature of Belarus more towards ethnic Russians. What happens is the Soviet Union shifts most of the Poles out, and during reconstruction, they construct a whole bunch of industry in the Belarusian SSR, and that attracts a large number of labourers, ethnic Russians from the Russian SSR and other areas of the Soviet Union, which confirms that Belarus from then on has a more Russian character. So when a Lithuanian MP jokingly puts out a tweet claiming that Smolensk is rightfully Lithuanian, or when Poles and Ukrainians claim Belarusians as their brothers, or when Russia claims that Belarus is historically Russian while Lithuania claims that it's historically Lithuanian, and the Belarusians claim that Belarus is historically, well, Belarusian, the correct answer is, well, yes, depending on which part of history you look at and what you emphasise. That's just the nature of Eastern European history. And frankly, I don't think we'd have it any other way. Belarus today is a post-Soviet state with a declining population of 9.2 million, so it has demographic features kind of like Russia, a strong imbalance towards females and an ageing population in general. It's often wrongly depicted as cartoonishly poor. I blame some travel bloggers in particular for popularising this image. In reality, Belarus is a state with a GDP per capita of about 6,000 per person. That's a little bit less than half of Poland. When you do the adjustment for purchasing power parity, it's giving you a country where the average GDP per capita is about the same in terms of purchasing power as Americans who would be earning $20,000 per year. In Poland, that's 37,000 for comparison. Russia's about 12,000 nominal, 32,800 purchasing power parity respectively, but that was before this crisis broke out and everything just went a little bit haywire. Overall, the country has a GDP of about 58 billion. That makes it about the size of Montana in terms of nominal terms. And the economy is still highly reliant on state-owned or state-dominated enterprises, particularly in the manufacturing space. Belarus didn't privatize most of its industry, unlike Russia. So instead of having oligarch-dominated industries, you still basically have the old state-owned enterprises from the Soviet era. They're just now controlled by the Lukashenko government rather than the old Soviet government. The nation is a member of the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, and in a union state agreement with Russia. Both those words are going to become very significant later when we talk about the implications of any NATO involvement in Belarus, or if Belarus gets involved in the Ukrainian conflict. So in short, this is a small, in terms of population, low middle income country with a still Soviet-style economic model. But really, if you're going to talk about Belarus, if you're going to understand Belarus, you need to talk about its leader. You need to talk about Alexander Lukashenko. You need to talk about this guy. Wait, no, not this guy. Yeah, this guy. Much better. Lukashenko has ruled Belarus since 1994, and I get to call this guy a dictator without worrying about the consequences, because he calls himself one. There's no fig leaf of democracy here. This guy has proudly at times stared into the camera and called himself Europe's last dictator, and he has followed a fairly traditional dictator progression. He ran for election in 1994, and by all accounts he won relatively legitimately. This guy had served in the Soviet Army and in the Soviet border troops and in some local administrative roles, but in 1994 he ran as a non-partisan anti-corruption populist, saying that he was going to protect the people against the corruption of the others that were running. Of course, one of the first things he did was he started bypassing the legislature and trying to extend his term. Eventually, he managed to remove term limits, start rigging elections pretty outrageously. We'll talk about those in a moment. He preserved basically the Soviet-style web of state-controlled enterprises. He retained a repressive media censorship and security system, and basically made Belarus one of the worst countries in Europe to be a journalist. The guy is eccentric, shall we say. Vodka and sauna treatments are his preferred treatment for fighting COVID-19, if you're interested. And he's got some interesting views on global politics and whatnot, but we won't dwell on it. Today we're going to focus on his potential role in the Ukraine crisis. Now, dictators come in many different varieties. Some are even genuinely popular. Lukashenko isn't. In the 2020 elections, he claimed to have been re-elected with a remarkable 80% of the vote, which clearly explains why the country lit up with hundreds of thousands of protesters as soon as the results were announced. Of course, he celebrated both during and after the election cycle by prosecuting opposing politicians and journalists, driving many into exile or arresting them on trumped-up charges. Still, 80% are rookie numbers. As my grandfather likes to remind me, Tito won at 97% in the 1953 Yugoslav elections. The source was "Trust me, bro," on behalf of the Yugoslav authorities, so 80% is clearly some credible rookie numbers for a dictator running for election. Now, the ostensible results caused hundreds of thousands of people in a country of only 9 million and a repressive security environment, remember, to turn out onto the streets, which is pretty damn impressive and probably a reasonable signal, along with other things like people sending in photos of their votes against Lukashenko, which just didn't square with official results at all. Probably pretty good proof that this election was, horrifically rigged. There were mass protests and there was a crackdown in order to bring people to heel. More recently, there have been other signs of resistance, but not the sort of mass protests we saw before. There's talk of military resistance to the Ukrainian mission, and there's also been cases of sabotage, which again we'll talk about later. It highlights that, let's just say, Lukashenko remains particularly unpopular in Belarus and doesn't have a complete and absolute control over the population. He is not equivalent to the Kim family in Korea in terms of the totalitarian control they enjoy, and he's also not equivalent to Vladimir Putin in terms of the sort of popularity he holds with the people. And speaking of Vladimir Putin, him and Lukashenko have a long and complex relationship. Lukashenko's been in power considerably longer than Putin, but since Putin's election, these guys have been brothers in arms against the West, or so the official story goes. Lukashenko at one point probably wanted to become the president of a union state. Lukashenko was convinced that if he could merge Belarus and Russia and then run in the Russian elections, he could win and become president of the whole shebang. Vladimir Putin came along and ruined that, because while Lukashenko could win over someone like Yeltsin, although, frankly, by 1999, a half-empty vodka bottle probably could have beaten Yeltsin in an election. Beating Vladimir Putin would have been a little bit harder. This relationship has gone back and forth at times. It's had sort of a bromance air at times, with Lukashenko referring to Russia as his big brother and referring affectionately to Vladimir Putin. There's been moments of just outright strange. But remember, is dictator of his own country, talking very proudly about how Vladimir Putin was going to make him a colonel of the Russian army, because Lukashenko only ever made it to lieutenant colonel, or so he claims, and says he can't promote himself, so he wanted Putin to promote him to colonel. And then when journalists asked him about this being kind of weird, he said that he should be promoted to be a colonel in the Soviet army, even though the Soviet army doesn't exist anymore. It's just a weird exchange. And he got very annoyed when Putin didn't follow through and in fact make him a colonel of either the Russian army or the Soviet army. And from the strange to the occasionally outright hostile. When Russia asked Belarus to recognize South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which are the Russian-controlled areas of Georgia, Belarus refused. Around 2020, Belarus and Lukashenko specifically accused the Russians of being involved with the opposition to try and potentially unseat him or indeed secure control of Belarus entirely. There have been odd cases where they accused Russia of sending mercenaries, a Wagner group, into Belarus in order to destabilize things in 2020, in order to cause such a destabilization scenario that Russia is able to take over Belarus. It's really bizarre in that Lukashenko both describes Putin as a brother and talks very fondly about Russia, but at the same time will occasionally accuse Russia of wanting to take over his country, which is a little bit at the other end of the spectrum. What I'm basically saying here is this is a complex relationship, but circumstances have pushed these two closer and closer together. With Russia and Belarus both increasingly isolated from the West, they've got fewer and fewer choices other than to get along, and Belarus is now more dependent on Moscow than ever. So what does this mean for the Ukraine war? And what would it take for Belarus to become directly militarily involved? And before I get into it, I want to kind of object to the question for a moment, because Belarus and Belarusians are currently involved in the Ukrainian war quite heavily. There are Belarusians on the ground now fighting in Ukraine. They're just fighting for Ukraine. Belarusian volunteers have been active from day one in supporting Ukraine against the Russian invasion, and their numbers are one of the more significant foreign contingents that have fought with Ukraine in this crisis so far. And then Belarus itself has obviously placed its territory at the disposal of the Russian army. The attacks on Kyiv and Chernihiv, these were launched from Belarusian territory. Missile attacks on Ukraine are routinely launched from Belarusian territory. Russian logistics were carried across Belarusian rail nets, where they were sabotaged by Belarusians. And in recent days, there is at least anecdotal evidence or claims from the Ukrainian side that the Belarusians are opening their ammunition warehouses and sending shipments by the trainload of ammunition to Russia. Whether this is Belarusian stocks being transferred or whether this is stocks that Russia had placed in Belarus for use that are now being taken back is uncertain. There are also probably Belarusians fighting in Wagner Group or other pro-Kremlin authorities, so there are probably Belarusian nationals fighting on both sides of this crisis. My point is, Belarus is not exactly sidelined at the moment. The nation is providing everything short of kinetic assistance to the Russians, and Belarusian nationals are actively fighting in the war. And depending on which sources you value and go with, the plan may have been for Belarus to be involved in this invasion from the start. What we do know is that soon after the invasion started, Lukashenko goes on TV showing what appears to be the battle plan in terms of axes of advance for the so-called special military operation into Ukraine, which caused a whole bunch of discussion because, one, it quite accurately plotted some of the axes of advance towards Kyiv, towards Kharkiv, and in the Donbass and out towards Mykolaiv and Odessa, but also because it seemed to suggest there was a plan to link up with Transnistria and possibly threaten Moldova. So, good job Lukashenko on just amping up concern in Europe just that little bit more. The official Belarusian narrative from Lukashenko and co. is that Belarus is not directly militarily involved and is not going to get directly militarily involved. The Belarusian opposition forces in exile tell a little bit of a different story. Svietlana Tsikhanouskaya, who was Lukashenko's ostensible opponent in the 2020 presidential elections, and according to most European sources, probably the popular vote winner, she openly favours Ukraine in this conflict and sees weakening Russia, as do many of the opposition figures, as a way of breaking a perceived Russian hold over Belarus and opening the way for liberation. These sort of opposition forces put forward a little bit of a different narrative. There were instructions to either prepare for war or indeed to initiate war from Lukashenko. And these led to large-scale resignations, officers taking leave, troops just trying to leave the army by any means necessary, and indeed they even claim that the chief of the general staff of Belarus tried to resign because Belarus just couldn't put together combat units that were willing and fully formed and fully manned and willing to go into Ukraine. Now, the Belarusian government, of course, says that Gulevich is still the chief of the general staff, and they respond to the accusations that he had resigned by pointing out that only the commander-in-chief, so Lukashenko, can relieve the chief of the general staff. So in essence, the two competing narratives here are this. Either Lukashenko didn't want to get involved, and that's why he's not involved, or Lukashenko wanted to be involved, but was stopped because the military, the society and government around him made it impossible for him to practically move in and invade. Now, unpicking the reality of those conversations at the heart of the Belarusian government, that's probably the domain of detailed signals and human intelligence, and frankly, I'd rather not speculate. What isn't speculation is that since the invasion has started, Lukashenko has looked like a man looking for a reason. He's tried every narrative under the sun on for size in terms of trying to get the Belarusian people on board with the idea of some sort of military preparation. He's argued that the West is planning on attacking Russia, like invading Russia, Barbarossa style, through Belarus and Ukraine, which is, to be fair, kind of how geography works, but also patently insane. And if the West isn't planning to attack Russia, well, Ukraine is either planning to or has actively attacked Belarus. So, before the war started and soon afterwards, Lukashenko's basically claimed that if the Russians didn't launch the operation, Ukraine was going to invade Belarus, for reasons I don't entirely understand, especially given that Belarus has an alliance with Russia through the CSTO, which would have meant that a Ukrainian invasion of Belarus would have caused a Russian invasion of Ukraine, and Ukraine would have had no international support for that activity. But there you go. He also claims that his air defense system has shot down many Ukrainian missiles that have been fired at Belarus. Because again, reasons. And then there's my favorite Lukashenko claim. This is probably, as far as I'm concerned, this one's even better than vodka cures COVID. Poland and NATO are planning to invade Ukraine to steal Western Ukraine for Poland. And as a result, Belarus will be encircled. So Belarus has to be prepared to act in order to ensure that NATO doesn't invade Ukraine and seize it, encircling Belarus. Poland, I know you're listening. I've got a lot of Polish viewers. Did you guys know that you're planning on invading Ukraine? I would love to know how politically viable a political platform in Europe at the moment, which would be, hey guys, we need to invade Ukraine and annex parts of its territory. I'd really like to know how that would fly with the Polish electorate, or the German electorate, or the ephemeral NATO electorate. And I can mock the idea because it is worthy of mockery. But at the end of the day, all of these presage a really dangerous point, which is that it seems to be that Lukashenko is in the media jockeying to try and get his people or his military, or to convince Moscow that there are reasons that Belarus should be supportive of Russia's invasion. So let's just say Lukashenko does decide to invade. Let's decide the Belarusians do throw their weight behind the Russian operation and send their military into Ukraine. What does the Belarusian military look like? What is the threat profile to Ukraine? Well, I'll start with the good in inverted commas, because so many commentators on YouTube and the internet love to obsess about equipment numbers, and equipment numbers are kind of the best that you can get when you're looking at the Belarusian army. They've got a very large stock of old Soviet equipment, basically all left over from the military units that used to be in the Belarusian military district before the fall of the Soviet Union. They have more than 500 tanks, and these are all military balance 2021 figures as usual, so I have consistency between my presentations. These are overwhelmingly T-72B, not T-72B3, T-72B, which is, if I remember correctly, the 1985-ish variant. So this is not the most modern tank in the world, but it's also not T-62 and the really old stuff that we've seen surfacing in Ukraine. They've got about 700 artillery pieces. Most of that is self-propelled 152mm stuff, or it's 122mm Grad rocket artillery. They've got some heavier pieces as well. They've got more than 900 BMP-2s as their infantry transport. Those are the vehicles you see in the bottom right there. This is decent. I mean, it's not as modern as the most modern infantry transports that we've seen Russia using, but we've also seen a whole bunch of BMP-1s, which are far older and inferior in service in Ukraine. And then they've got a collection of heavy systems in centrally controlled units. So not in regular army units, but in units directly controlled by the Ministry of Defense or separately. And this includes 36 examples of the Tochka, tactical ballistic missile system, and 60 of the older Scuds, which Western observers will associate with Gulf War I and Iraq's missile armament. Now, both of these missile systems are relatively inaccurate. Tochka has a CEP of about 150 metres, that is, half of its rounds will land within 150 metres of the aiming point. Scud B has a CEP of like 450 metres. So it's a coin flip of if you land within half a kilometre of the target, roughly. People like to claim this means that Soviet designers built shit missiles. I just like to casually remind people that when these systems were designed, they were primarily designed to carry nuclear warheads, and those tend to be a little more tolerant than a couple of 100 kilos of high explosives. But this is the long-range punch of the Belarusian military, these missile systems. And there's a small air force. There's 2 squadrons of MiG-29s, 2 squadrons of MiG-25s. These are a little bit older, they're not top of the shelf, they're not top rate, but they're perfectly serviceable in the Ukrainian context, a small but relevant air force. It's notable that some of these numbers dwarf European powers. Belarus has a lot more tanks than Germany or France or the United Kingdom. It's got a lot more artillery than any of them. And were Belarus a Ukrainian ally rather than a Russian ally, the sort of resupply of Warsaw Pact era equipment that it could offer to Ukraine would actually be pretty transformative when you compare it to the amount of equipment that's come from nations like Poland or Czechia or Slovakia so far. So Belarus's problem isn't metal, it's manpower. And that's the fact that the Belarusian army is tiny. The regular army units, so not including the Special Operations Forces or those units reporting directly to the MOD, is about 10,000 strong. The Air Force and Air Defense Forces together are about 11,000 strong. Belarus does the old German thing where the Luftwaffe used to control the anti-aircraft artillery, the flak guns. Air defense is integrated in Belarus. The SAMs and the aircraft are held by the same people. There are about 5,900 troops in what they call the Belarusian Special Operations Forces. Now, this is a mixture. This is a bit of a misnomer. Now, these are the only fully manned brigades, like full-time, full-strength brigades in the Belarusian army. but they're divided between Spetsnaz units, which are the kind of guys that were used to put down the protests in 2020, and the airborne units, which were not uniformly used against protests, but were instead sent towards the borders. Just an interesting division there that'll become relevant later. The joint units are the units that operate under the direction of the MOD, and they hold things like the heavy artillery, the Tochkas, and the Scuds. There are also very large paramilitary forces because it's a totalitarian government, like you always have very large paramilitary forces, but so do some democracies, it's worth noting. There's about 12,000 border troops, 87,000 members of the militia, and 11,000 internal troops who are patterned after the Russian equivalent. And when you're looking at the sort of troops that would put down internal dissent, you're really looking first at those internal troops and also at the Spetsnaz elements of the Special Operations Force. A notable thing here, this is a largely conscript-based army. Belarusian males do 18-month terms in the military. Russians do 12 months. So this is a more heavily weighted force towards conscripts. There are fewer kontraktniki than there are in the Russian army. This is a force which is dependent for its manpower on its conscripts, and frankly, the training standards of those conscripts is really up to question. And the biggest reason I question that, before we get into all the anecdotal evidence of training being minimal, Belarus has a defense budget in 2020 of $616 million US. And I don't care whether you do more with less, there's only so far you can go with a defense budget of $616 million. That is 1/100th of the Russian defense budget in nominal terms. 1/100th. It's a tiny fraction of what countries like the Netherlands or Belgium spend on their defense forces. And as a result, there's very little equipment modernization, there's little money out there for expensive exercises, only the special operations units are fully manned at all times, and there is an open question over how much they could possibly equip, maintain, and motivate troops for combat service and maintain high readiness rates. Because readiness rates are important. If you're maintaining equipment, if you're exercising your troops, and you're doing the necessary amount of training, you're making sure your pilots have their flying hours, that eats up cash incredibly quickly. Anecdotally, combat training for most units seems to be pretty limited. The number of rounds fired in training seems to be pretty limited. The amount of fuel allocated to exercises, again, pretty limited. And basing conditions, pay, and other conditions, pretty minimal and primitive. But like I say, that's mostly anecdotal evidence. If you're going to choose an analytics point here, we can actually look at the Russians and how the Russians have performed. So we've identified readiness issues with the Russian army, motivation issues with the Russian army, shortfalls in training, and we know that in nominal terms, the Russian defense budget was about $60 billion US, compared to a Belarusian budget of $616 million. So it's pretty safe to assume then that an equivalently sized Belarusian force is going to underperform a Russian regular army force of the same size in Ukraine. The Belarusian force is going to have older equipment, it's not going to have drones, it's not going to have up-to-date training, it's going to have older systems, and it's going to have a lower base of combat experience. They don't have troops that went to Syria that gained combat experience, and they don't have the funds from the waves of modernization that Russia has been undertaking over the last several years. And given the difficulties that even those regular Russian military units have faced in Ukraine, that's a pretty dire prognosis for the combat power of the Belarusian army. But if Belarus does decide to get involved, if they do decide to invade Ukraine in support of the Russians, what do those intervention scenarios look like and what are the prospects of success? And here I've chosen 3 scenarios that are the most common that I was able to find appearing in media speculation. They're not the scenarios that I think are most likely, they're the scenarios that people have talked about most frequently and so most deserve a response. And the first scenario is that they do February 24th again, but this time with feeling. It's another attack on Kyiv after taking the border cities of like Sumy and Chernihiv, where the Belarusian army goes in support of a Russian force in a joint operation to take Kyiv and win the war. Anecdotally, this idea seems to be more common in English-speaking media and in English-speaking pro-Russian internet commentators than it does in, shall I say, more serious Russian milli-blogger or pro-Russian circles. So as I said, the idea is you run February 24th again. This time you don't push light forces down roads. You go in with an armoured spearhead well supported by artillery. You blast your way to Kyiv and using the additional manpower of a reinforced Russian contingent, and all of the troops that Belarus is able to bring to bear, suddenly you have enough force in order to take Kyiv, overthrow Zelensky, win the war, home by Christmas, Ura. Now, I am not in the military, but from a historical and logical perspective, I struggle to understand why people think the Belarusian army would be able to achieve in this situation what the Russians in late February were not able to do. In this situation, you're comparing a largely Belarusian force with some stiffening by Russian units in a situation where Ukraine has had months to prepare, to mine roads, to rig bridges, to train new troops, to dig trenches, to mobilize and organize its population. You're comparing their chances to a Russian force which included some elite units from the VDV, which also had a degree of surprise, to a largely Belarusian force which would have no surprise running up against much better prepared Ukrainian defences. It's made worse by the fact that Belarus just doesn't have the same tactical and operational options that an equivalent Russian force does. I have pointed out some difficulties that the Russians have faced, some weaknesses in the Russian force structure and the Russian way of war. But at the same time, the Russians do have a lot going for them. They have some quite advanced tools in the electronic warfare space. They do have things like drones. They have been able to do large-scale exercises. They have some ability to do precision artillery fire with Krasnopol. And they have the ability to bring very large fires to bear. Belarus has none of that, and it would be running into the teeth of much better prepared Ukrainian defences. So my question is, why would a largely Belarusian force succeed when a primarily Russian force under better circumstances had failed? You could argue Belarus would just play a support role for a renewed Russian offensive, but if that was the case, the Russian forces have to come from somewhere if they're doing most of the fighting, and that means they're coming from the east in the Donbass, or they're coming from the Kherson front, all of which seem like bad ideas, considering there is a reason that Russia decided to pull out from the Kyiv front in the first place, and it wasn't as a goodwill gesture, or at least I conclude it's not as a goodwill gesture. And if the Belarusians went in without significant Russian support and tried to take Kyiv, well, I think it would have about the efficacy of a forehead taking on a concrete wall. I don't think it would go particularly well. Now, option 2 is something a little bit different, and this is a genuine favourite in a lot of Western media. I've seen this pop up in a number of publications. It also appears in things like Reddit posts, forum posts, comments on my own videos, people asking whether or not Belarus could attack the western part of Ukraine in order to sever the supply line of Western weapons and equipment that are flowing into Ukraine. And the idea here seems relatively intuitive. Ukraine is kept in the fight by a combination of the fighting spirit of its own people and its mobilization efforts at home, but also the supply of arms and ammunition from overseas. Without the supply of modern Western weapons and replacement ammunition for its old Soviet weapons, Ukraine's capacity to resist is limited. So the idea here is the Belarusian army pushes, probably from Brest, pushes south and tries to take Lviv. And this is the primary artery through which Western military supplies follow. There's about 300 kilometres to cover in this plan. But if you look at a rail map of Belarus, you might think it's possible. There's an electrified rail line, the prime line that goes all the way down to Brest, and then south there is a non-electrified rail line that might be able to sustain an offensive. So maybe you look at a map and you think, hey, they might be able to pull that off. And yes, this would be really bad for Ukraine if it worked. The problem is it's an absolute pipe dream to think that it would work. And the problem is more than just sustaining an advance well beyond the distance that the Russians themselves started to have problems with during the initial offensive against Kyiv. The problem here is you're assuming that your opponent doesn't do anything in response, which, to be fair, in business and in warfare is often where bad plans come unstuck. How do you think Poland and NATO would respond to having a large Belarusian offensive launched that close, running along the Polish border towards the city of Lviv, a city with key historical and logistical significance to Poland and to NATO? NATO drones and NATO surveillance aircraft are doing flights every day over the Black Sea and over the Polish-Ukrainian border. One of the advantages the Russians have fighting in the Donbass is it's as far away as is possible from the flight paths that these NATO aircraft are able to fly. You're now talking about launching an offensive right along the Polish border. I think it's in line to become the most transparent, most surveilled battle space in human history, as every NATO surveillance aircraft, AWACS, drone, every surveillance platform they can find gets doing laps along that border, surveilling every inch of a Belarusian military offensive as it tracks south towards its final objective. And that information could be piped readily and easily to the defenders. And that's assuming that the only sort of intervention NATO would be willing to launch here would be passive information sharing. You could make life hell for Belarusian pilots and Russian pilots operating in this area. You could light their missile warning alerts at any given time. You could put your own aircraft flying on your side of the border, meaning that their anti-aircraft troops are going to really hesitate when they see a contact that may or may not be just over the Ukrainian side of the border, which they can't identify as either a Polish aircraft or a Ukrainian aircraft because they really don't want to start World War III by accident. Who wants to give the Poles a reason? And that's just the tip of the iceberg in the ways that NATO could make life difficult for the Belarusians or the Russians if they tried to launch this sort of offensive in the far west. At the same time, you're talking about taking a specific objective. That objective is where all the weapons that Ukraine is receiving from the west go to, and it's only 180 kilometers from the primary base where a lot of this stuff is being transported into Poland in the first place. Rzeszów is there in the blue circle. That's the primary airbase which is seeing a lot of these weapon shipments arrive in from overseas, and then it's being shipped across the border to Ukraine. You're talking about a 180-kilometre supply route to get emergency supplies from Poland into Ukraine, and you're talking about offending against the base where all that stuff is stored. It would be very, very easy for NATO to surge supplies across that border, and with whatever manpower Ukraine could pull together, you could find yourself very quickly at the end of your own supply line 300 kilometres from your jumping off point, suddenly facing an influx of precision munitions supported by information gathered by drones that are overhead 24/7, that are coordinated by NATO. It's really bad as an idea. So unless this one's going to be telegraphed well in advance with massive Russian reinforcements, followed by a complete absence of NATO responsive action and a lack of response from the Ukrainians, I'm tempted to put this one in the pipe dream category, or at the very least, the low confidence interval of something that they would ever consider actually attempting. I mean, given the risk of there suddenly being a whole bunch of Polish-speaking Ukrainian in inverted commas units in Lviv, if necessary, if it ever came under genuine threat, I think calling this a low credibility approach might even be going too far. But who knows? As I said before, it's been a strange war. A more realistic approach is probably not to try and take anything significant at all. It would be to just use Belarusian troops as a distraction, either bolstering Russian forces or by themselves. And the idea here would be to do little more than force Ukraine to split its efforts between holding its northern front and fighting in the east and the south against the Russians. Presumably this would be an artillery and missile-based fight, so something that plays to Belarus's relative strengths, so large volleys of relatively inaccurate tactical ballistic missiles like the Scuds and the Tochkas, followed by artillery work with the infantry not pushing too hard or too fast. This is probably within Belarus's capabilities, depending on what Ukrainian units come out to fight it, and we know the Ukrainians have kept some reserves around Kyiv. The question is why you do this, and what you would gain by doing this that you can't gain by just not attacking and leaving your forces in the area, forcing Ukraine to keep troops up there just in case you actually attack. You know, an actual feint, where you act like you're going to attack at any given moment, forcing your opponent to adapt, but don't actually follow through the maximum level of economy force that you can possibly realise. And so it may be the case, according to some schools of thought, that doing nothing is actually the best option. Ukraine currently has to keep military forces, border guards and reserves up guarding Kyiv in case there is a push out of Belarus. Russia doesn't have to commit its finest combat power in order to support Belarusian troops. It doesn't have to hedge against Belarus getting into trouble or suddenly collapsing. So even while this sort of operation would be within the capabilities of a Belarusian or a combined Belarusian-Russian force, it's actually hard to understand how an actual attack would achieve better results in terms of cost efficiency than not attacking but looking like you might at any given moment. And given that Russia withdrew from this attack originally for a reason, it's hard to understand what about the strategic or operational picture calls for Belarus to launch a largely unsupported offensive on the same axis all over again, expecting better results. But there's a second part to this analysis. It's not just what an intervention might look like, it's why might Lukashenko be a little bit nervous about committing his military in an offensive operation in Ukraine? Why might he be hesitating? Other than the fact that you're talking about sending a military with a budget of $600 million a year into the teeth of some of the most modern weapon systems that NATO can ship across the border. And the first point is probably just internal stability. Lukashenko isn't Putin when it comes to popularity. Even Vladimir Putin's opponents will admit that there is a significant share of the Russian population, quite possibly a decent majority of the Russian population, that supports Vladimir Putin and supports his so-called special military operation in Ukraine. The same cannot be said for Lukashenko. We saw this in the response to the elections in 2020, which were a far cry from anything approximating support. And what polling we do have from Belarus suggests really quite in the pits levels of approval for Lukashenko as president. We've also seen this manifested in a number of ways. Sabotage of rail systems was something that was very common early in the war and may actually have had a significant impact on the ability of the Russians to sustain their logistics against Kyiv and Sumy and Chernihiv, because the Belarusian railway workers kept sabotaging the ability to move trains along their tracks. There have been protests and there are words of military discontent. Now, a lot of commentators make the jump to then say, well, Lukashenko needs the army at home in order to control dissent. I think that's a little bit simplistic. Only some of the army would really be suitable for controlling dissent in the first place. A bunch of fresh-faced conscripts with no motivation and no love for the regime are not the people who I would give guns and then ask to shoot protesters. That's probably the job of the Spetsnaz brigades, it's probably the job of internal troops and people who are genuinely loyal to the regime. So I'm not convinced that the whole thing falls apart if they no longer have conscript troops to fall back on. But consider this from a domestic political situation. Putin, who is much more popular, much more secure in a wealthier, more capable country, is unwilling to deploy conscripts to Ukraine. And one of the best theories for this is that to do so and to declare general mobilization would endanger political stability and popularity at home. Belarus is a more fraught position with a lower level of governmental popularity and is much more dependent on conscripts in its army. It can't really go to war without sending conscripts. So to assume Belarus is going to war in any significant sense assumes that Belarus can survive a sort of social and political disruption that Russia can't. If you assume that Putin is right and that sending conscripts into Ukraine would endanger political stability in Russia, it is hard to understand how doing exactly the same thing wouldn't cause even greater political disruptions in the context of a country like Belarus. And if you look at what survey information we do have available, it's actually even worse than that, because it's not just about sending conscripts forward, it's about support for the military operation in general. And I'm going to be the first one to say that there are limits when it comes to surveying people and doing opinion polls, but they can be a lot more scientific than anecdotes in how many people have sent emails or who's written how many articles in the international media. You can control for factors like demography, age, location, etc. Now, Chatham House have done a survey, so that's the Royal Institute of International Affairs, did do a survey in Belarus in April and March to gauge their support for and responses to the popularity of the special military operation, as the Russians call it. Now, they made great efforts to try and correct for various demographic factors. There are obviously things you can't control for, like, for example, the fact that even if you say a survey is anonymous, maybe people in a country where speaking your mind can be dangerous might be nervous to give the wrong answer, in inverted commas, to a survey, or may refuse to participate at all. Nonetheless, statistically speaking, the survey has an error margin of about 3.5%, I think, from memory, and the results are particularly telling. When you ask Belarusians what Belarus should do, given the outbreak of war between Russia and Ukraine, and you look at the results and you give them the option to pick one option from a variety of options, only 6% of the Belarusian population said that they should take part in the conflict on the same side as Russia. 3% said that they should actually join the fight but on Ukraine's side, which is a pretty gutsy response to give when you're still living in a country that is ruled by Lukashenko. 27% said support Russia's actions but don't engage in a military conflict, and 23% said declare neutrality and expel all foreign troops, which presumably would include Russian troops, and limit their ability to launch attacks from Ukraine from that direction. Now, it is possible to launch a people on an unpopular war, but 6% is pretty bad as a starting point for galvanizing domestic support for an offensive military operation, especially when 3% of the population actually say you should be fighting but on the other side, 6% say that you should support Ukraine but not engage in the conflict. That's pretty problematic as a starting point to motivate a people to go to war, especially when you're going to be sending conscripts and mobilized personnel. And perhaps that feeds in the responses to the next question. where the question was, what do you think the Belarusian military would do if it was ordered to actually go and attack Ukraine? And again, they were given a limited number of options. Only 23% said they actually thought the army would go and fight Ukraine. 22% said that the army would either refuse to fight or it would just lay down its arms. 19% said, well, they participate, but they try not to use their weapons. They try not to actually do anything useful. And when you think about an army that is based on artillery and long-range weapons, all it takes is someone slipping or getting the target wrong, and all those shells are just going into empty fields rather than anything effective. 19% said they thought the soldiers would just try and get out of the war zone by any means possible, which I take to mean, desertion, leaving Belarus. 15% said they thought the army people would just quit, like they'd just leave the military as much as they could. And 10% said they'd just, surrender to Ukraine. That's, again, pretty problematic in terms of the efficiency of a fighting force. If only 20% of your population think the military would actually fight if ordered to fight, then you're taking a really big political gamble in sending those troops into battle in the first place. I mean, this really sounds like a recipe for potential armed unrest, the disintegration of your army, the endangerment of the regime pretty damn quickly. Russia has already had problems with some servicemen refusing to go into combat in Ukraine. And that is in the context of an operation that still, even when you talk to those people who oppose the Russian invasion within Russia, still think that about 70% or more than 70% of the population has support it. And they're still having issues. Imagine the issues the Belarusians would have when 6% of the population think that the operation is a good idea, and the vast majority of people think that the army is just going to surrender or not do its job if it's ordered forward. That's a recipe for disaster. And here's the thing about projections of political instability. This is the cheap out for anyone who wants to put together a fanciful war plan or strategy. Just assume that your opponent will fall apart. They couldn't possibly do it. If you just kick in the door, the population will rise up and join you, has been the catch-all of so many failed plans throughout history. But at the same time, in the case of Belarus, there seems to be genuine suggestions, not that necessarily the regime would instantly collapse, but that the army would have a real time motivating its troops to actually participate in anything like an effective way. And that may be a genuine path to political destabilization. Another problem might just be the vulnerability of the Belarusian economy. Belarus starts from the position of being a poorer, smaller, less financially capable nation than Russia, with greater external dependencies. The nation's already been hit really hard by sanctions and the exit of Western companies, and indeed one of the drivers of Belarusian growth and the diversification of the economy had been the growth of the IT sector. And of course, who are the first people to emigrate? What are the first businesses to be able to transition over borders and continue operation? It's businesses operating in the IT sector. The other parts of the economy had problems too. Belarusian refineries exported a lot of their stuff through the Baltic. That's now in danger. The economy was highly dollarized. That is, you'd often see prices for things like property quoted in dollars, not in Belarusian rubles, which obviously makes the whole country a little more vulnerable to being largely cut off from the supply of dollars and the circulation of them within the economy. There's already signs of some distress in the Belarusian economy. Already, Belarus is asking Russia for deferrals on its loan payments because Russia is the biggest holder of Belarus's external debt, and Belarus is talking about repaying its other foreign debts to hostile nations in rubles, which would constitute a constructive default. The question is how this nation is meant to survive, economically sustaining itself if sanctions tighten, which they would in the event of a war breaking out, but also just endure all of the greater expenses that come with fighting a war. The expenditure of equipment, the additional operational expenses, consumption of fuel, diesel, consumables, fuel, all the additional support that you need for troops when they're operationally deployed, plus all the additional payment required, and the disruption of taking people away from their jobs, assuming you call up reservists, as you probably do, in order to get up to full strength. It's just not clear how Belarus would sustain a war effort unless Russia is willing to economically bail it out, basically from the first week. And speaking of sanctions, there'd almost certainly be a NATO response to Belarus deciding to directly enter the war at Lukashenko's direction. People are quick to jump to the idea that NATO could use a kinetic response. They could actually bomb or invade Belarus and try and overthrow Lukashenko. You could recognize an opposition leader as interim leader and try and depose him. I don't give a huge amount of credibility to this idea only because Belarus is part of the CSTO. The CSTO is basically Russia's version of NATO. It applies to only some of the post-Soviet states, and it has a clause which is equivalent to Article 5 that says an act of aggression against one is an act of aggression against all, and this would run the risk of Russia identifying attacks against Belarus as it would attacks on itself. That said, if someone is in the brinksmanship mood and wants to argue that Belarus is not being aggressed against but rather defended against, someone could choose to push that escalation ladder a little bit. Belarus doesn't have its own nuclear weapons, and you have to ask the question of whether or not Vladimir Putin would really end the world over Lukashenko finding his life suddenly a little bit uncomfortable. What's more likely is an escalation of support for Ukraine, coupled with much, much harsher sanctions and maybe other measures directed against Belarus. There is a lot that foreign intelligence services could do to make Lukashenko's life really hard and to make him fear for his life and the stability of his regime at home. And at the same time, Belarus hasn't prepared the same resilience measures that Russia has. Belarus hasn't sequestered away hundreds of billions of dollars in foreign exchange. Belarus hasn't rekeyed its economy to be able to survive a sustained economic assault from neighbouring countries. If NATO chooses to turn the screws on Lukashenko, out of necessity, he's going to have to turn to Russia or China or a country like that for ever greater amounts of support. And that's a risk for a strongman figure like Lukashenko. But for me, all these questions kind of have it around the wrong way. We've asked a lot about, could Belarus attack? Do they have the capability? And the answer was probably not, at least not well. We've asked the questions of why wouldn't they? What would dissuade them? We've gone through that in some detail. But we have to assume for a moment that Lukashenko has some individual agency, and those around him have some agencies, and they might be a little bit selfish. Which leads me to ask the question that seems to often go unasked. What's in it for him? What is in it for Belarus to invade Ukraine in support of Russia? There's no territory to gain. Russia looks like they're gearing up to possibly annex parts of Ukraine or form new people's republics. There is an opportunity for Vladimir Putin to secure his ideology and legacy as the person who, in inverted commas, solved the Ukrainian question, protected the people of the Donbass, pushed Russia's boundaries ever forward, restored just a little bit of the imperial glory of the old Russian Empire. What does Belarus have to gain? There's no territory, there's no economic motivation in play. Lukashenko isn't the one who's going to come out looking glorious in the history books if it all goes perfectly, and there's every reason to believe it won't go perfectly. At the same time, he faces horrific risks. His regime is less stable, his military is less capable, his economy is less resilient. So you're talking about the pitch to Lukashenko being like, take far more risks than Vladimir Putin, but for basically no benefit. Because if Russia wins, you've got a strong Russia that is now holding your leash even tighter than before, and if Russia loses, well, you're probably being hung by your ankles from a street lamp, to be honest. Like, it's probably not going to end particularly well for you if you intervene in this war and then it all goes really, really badly. So no, I can't say that Belarus won't attack Ukraine. I can only say that from a rational perspective, there doesn't seem to be much to gain. Belarus would be invading in order to do Russia's bidding. But there's so much risk, there's so little payoff, and you have to wonder, is Vladimir Putin really going to risk deposing Lukashenko if he says no at the moment? Is he going to risk destabilizing his one ally, a critical logistic link in the chain if he ever wants to attack Kyiv right now? For me, the rational argumentation for Lukashenko really doesn't add up. So while I think they'll posture, I would be surprised if they directly entered the war on a large scale. Despite that, however, I do want to close out with a warning. And the warning is just because the Belarusian army is, to be fair, not great and operates on the smell of an oily rag so far as its budget goes, that doesn't mean it's harmless. And just because Lukashenko can seem like a little bit of a comedic figure from afar, just because I made a Mussolini joke, that doesn't mean he's harmless. Italy and Mussolini are worth calling out here. Maybe this is the best way to make the point. Italy lost approximately 500,000 military and civilian dead in World War II. The Italian economy was ruined because Mussolini decided to throw it into a war of imperial aggrandizement. And other peoples suffered as well. Greece, Albania, other parts of the Balkans, Libya, Ethiopia. In all of these places, civilian populations, military members, the economy. The impact of Mussolini's ambitions and Mussolini's not too great military was all too real and reverberated deeply across generations. You don't need a world-beating military in order to do immense damage to civilian infrastructure and run up casualty figures. You just need to be sufficiently bloody-minded. You can do a lot of damage with 500 tanks and a collection of tochkas and scuds. So if Belarus does, against the odds, decide to get involved in this conflict, it doesn't mean that it's going to be harmless. It might be inept. It might not be able to defeat major Ukrainian units in the field. It may ultimately achieve nothing in a strategic sense. But that doesn't mean that it can't happen, and it doesn't mean that if it does happen, it won't cause additional damage to the civilian population of Ukraine who have already suffered so much. So yes, I'll make the jokes. Yes, it's funny to think that you could try and run a major military force using 18-month term conscripts and a budget of $600 million a year, but that doesn't mean that army doesn't have the capacity to heap yet more tragedy on what has already been a tragic war. So in conclusion, in my view, an invasion by Belarus would not be rational. That doesn't mean it won't happen, it just means that the correct move, if he can avoid it for Lukashenko, if he values his own survival or the survival of his state, is not to get directly militarily involved in the war in Ukraine. The Belarusian army likely does not have the capability to, independent of Russian support, carry out deep operations into Ukraine, or to seize major urban centres. It's just not big enough, it's not structured that way, it doesn't have the budget. At the same time, such an intervention would risk major NATO escalation, which would be dangerous to Belarus, while existing half measures like posturing in order to draw Ukrainian forces or supplying equipment to Russia in order to sustain its effort allow Belarus to achieve a positive impact on Russia's chances without the risks associated with direct intervention, and thus I view them as more likely. Any involvement, if it does happen, however, even if it threatens the stability of Lukashenko's regime or whatnot, would still represent a major tragedy, which would likely mean additional suffering and death for members of both the Ukrainian armed forces and also the civilian population. So we all hope that it doesn't happen. Okay, channel update to close out. First thing to say is I am still travelling at the moment, so please forgive any oscillations in sound quality. I'm just moving between different environments and it's hard to make each one acoustically perfect. The second thing is to say to any Belarusians in the audience today, please understand that any criticisms in this video are squarely aimed at Lukashenko. I have nothing against Belarus or the Belarusian people, and indeed I hope to be able to visit Minsk one day under better circumstances. I also want to say thank you to viewers and commenters for the response to the last video. The artillery video took a lot of research, a lot of work, a lot of production, a lot of editing, and I am overjoyed with the response that the video got. And also just generally happy with the quality of discourse in my comment section. YouTube comment sections can be a real mixed bag, but mine seem to constantly be full of people making well-argued, reasoned points in a supportive fashion and engaging in constructive debate. So thank you to all who choose to engage. It genuinely does mean the world to me. The reason I actually moved this topic up and did it as a priority is because it was one of the most liked comments in the comment section of one of my recent videos. So I do read the comments, I do take them on board, and it does impact, in some cases, my decisions around content. Now, so far as the wider channel, once I do get back home, I'm going to look at things from an organisational perspective again. It's been hard while I'm travelling, but once I'm back, I've got some offers to assist with subtitling that have been on the back burner for months. I want to get that operational. Some people have been offering to do translations. I want to get back to them and see if I can get translated subtitles put in as well. And of course, there are things like Discord. If I go down that route, I will put out a call for people, probably for Patreons first, who are experienced in Discord moderation to see if people are willing to assist in doing so. The final thing to say is that the reception to the channel continues to be incredible. At the time of recording, we're at 188,000. We're well on the way to 200, which is just well beyond the reception I thought I would get when I first did a video on Russian procurement policy soon after the outbreak of this war. It's given me some confidence that even as Ukraine transitions out of the news cycle, although it will never transition out of my news cycle, I can still branch out and look at topics more generally. That means looking at other questions of defence economics or defence valuations around the world. It means looking particularly at the idea of European defence and European defence industry integration, and a raft of other topics, both historic and contemporary. So thank you so much for your ongoing support. It means the absolute world to me. Thank you very much, and I'll see you all again soon.